Just a second, and yeah. Great. So, shall I begin, ma'am? A very warm welcome to one and all present. It is such a great pleasure to see you all here. We are very excited to present to you the second session of the two-day Young Researchers Conference on As a Matter of Effect, Making Sense of Planetarity. And now for the moment we have all been waiting for. Today we have the honor of hosting Professor Tim Ingold, FBA, FRSC, Professor Emeritus of Social Anthropology, University of Aberdeen, with us to deliver the special keynote session. We will be recording today's lecture, and at the same time, it is being live streamed for our audience and subscribers on YouTube. There will be a question and answer session at the end of Professor Ingold's talk, and everyone is requested to post your questions on the chat box, which will be then addressed to Professor Ingold. This conference is being organized under the guidance of our head of the department, Professor Simi Malhotra. I request Simi ma'am to kindly welcome and introduce Professor Ingold.
Thank you, Jubi. Professor Tim Ingold, I, on behalf of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, extend a very warm welcome to you to the second session of the Young Researchers Conference on As a Matter of Affect, Making Sense of Planetarity. I'm extremely grateful to you, Professor Ingold, for being so indulgent and for so readily agreeing to be a part of our conference. Friends, we are extremely fortunate to have with us Professor Tim Ingold, one of the leading thinkers of our times, as our keynote speaker today. It is a singular honor and privilege for us here at Jamia at the Department of English to host Professor Ingold, and we are all eagerly waiting to hear him speak on living together in difference. Though he needs no introduction whatsoever anywhere in the world or here, it is my pleasure and privilege and duty to introduce Professor Ingold formally. Professor Tim Ingold is Professor Emeritus of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. He has carried out fieldwork among Sami and Finnish people in Lapland, and the resulting monograph was a study of the ecological adaptation, social organization, and ethnic politics of the small minority community under conditions of post-war resettlement. Professor Ingold has written extensively on environment, technology, and social organization in the circumpolar north, on animals in human society, as also on human ecology and evolutionary theory. His more recent works explore environmental perception and skill practice. His interests lie in the interface between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture. His recent books include Lines, a History, where Professor Ingold practically lays the foundations for a completely new discipline, the anthropological archaeology of the line. His work, Being Alive, Essays on Movement, Knowledge, and Description, explores rich themes such as the vitality of materials, the perception and formation of the ground, the mingling of earth and sky and the weather world, the experiences of light, sound, and feeling, the role of storytelling in the integration of knowledge, and the potential of growing to unite observation and description. Professor Ingold's The Perception of the Environment in 2000 offers a persuasive approach to understanding how human beings perceive their surroundings. His work, Making Anthropology, Archaeology, Art, and Architecture, published in 2013, ties the four disciplines together in a way that has never been attempted before. In a radical departure from conventional studies that treat art and architecture as compendia of objects for analysis, Professor Ingold proposes an anthropology and archaeology, not of, but with art and architecture. He advocates a way of thinking through making, in which sentient practitioners and active materials continually answer to or correspond with one another in the generation of form. His groundbreaking work, Lines, A Brief History, published in 2015, offers a wholly original series of meditations on life, ground, weather, walking, imagination, and what it means to be human. His other works include Anthropology and As Education, published in 2018, Anthropology, Why It Matters, again in 2018. In his work, Correspondences, 2020, Professor Ingold corresponds with landscapes and forests, oceans and skies, monuments and artwork. To each, he brings the same spontaneity of thought and observation, the same intimacy and lightness of touch, as also the same affection, longing, and care that in the days when we used to write letters by hand, we would bring to our correspondences with one another. It is such an honor and privilege for us, Professor Ingold, to have you here with us to deliver this special keynote address. And we are so, so grateful to you, Professor Ingold, for accepting our invitation and for sharing your time and your scholarship with us. We're really looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much, Professor Ingold.
Well, thank you very much. The privilege is all mine. I'm extremely honored to be among you today and bring you greetings from our part of the world. So yes, my talk is called On Living Together in Difference. And the thesis, the core thesis that I want to argue is that we are all inhabitants of one world. I'm rather annoyed with scholars in the humanities and social sciences who keep talking about how we're inhabiting all these multiple worlds, as though we're all stuck in different worlds. My feeling is that we all inhabit one world, but it is nevertheless a world of continual and inexhaustible differentiation. And I want to argue that it's this difference that actually brings us all together. Identity, by contrast, divides us by putting all those who share one particular identity in one camp into a common we against all of those who do not, and shifting all difference then onto a categorical boundary between us and them. I want to argue for a different sense of similarity, not similarity as identity, but a similarity that lies in continuity. And I want to argue for a sense of difference that lies in differentiation rather than diversity. We, then, when we talk about we and who we are, we is not defined oppositionally by way of a contrast with them, but rather relationally as something that spreads out without limit from where I am or happen to be to all the others with whom I converse. And that, like the wave spreading out when you throw a pebble into the water, it can just spread out and out and out from the center where I am. So that means that we is a community of relations that is bound, but not bounded by difference. So the one world that I think we all inhabit is not a flatbed of universals. It's not the natural purpose, not the natural preserve of a global humanity, but a field of infinite and ever-emerging variation. Or to put it in another term, this one world is a conversation. People join in a conversation because each comes with different experience. And because each comes with different experience, each participant in the conversation has something to give, something to contribute. So the community, the conversational community, is not just about living together, it is about giving together. It actually comes from the Latin communus. Munus is gift, com means together. So community means giving together, and you can only give if you have something to contribute that other people don't have. So the very possibility of community is founded on difference in experience, not on the fact that everybody has interest in common or shares some common traits or attributes. What binds people together in community in the conversation is their differences. The philosopher Alfonso Linguis has a lovely title for one of his books. It's called The Community of Those Who Have Nothing in Common, precisely bringing out this idea that it's because we are not all the same that we can join together in some form of social life. The philosopher John Dewey talked about it as the production of like-mindedness, the way in which people coming from different backgrounds, you would say you and I, we come from different backgrounds, we might speak different languages, we have all sorts of different experiences, but by me projecting my experience forward in my imagination and you doing the same, we can arrive at a place of like-mindedness, where a kind of point at which we can understand one another, which then allows us to carry the conversation forward. So that it's through that that actually life is able to carry on rather than getting stuck or regressing to some kind of baseline of what everybody has in common to begin with. It actually moves life forward, that we in conversation project our experience forward so that we can meet the experience of others coming from a different place, achieve that position of like-mindedness, of togetherness, that then enables us to carry the conversation on into further differentiation. And that ensures what Dewey called, most importantly, the continuity of life. And that, in his view, was the purpose of education. So we could say that every participant in the conversation is a particular life. It's my life, your life, or whatever, a life cycle. But the conversation itself is life as a whole. I mean, one way to picture this is by thinking of a rope. A rope is twisted from many, many strands of fiber. Every particular strand is only so long. There's a strand of grass or hemp or whatever it's made of, it may be this long. But as you're winding the rope, new strands get introduced as fast as old strands gradually give out. And so through the overlap of strands along their length, the rope can carry on winding indefinitely, even though every strand is only so long. So that's one way of imagining the relationship between the particular life, that is the strand, and life as a whole, that is the rope. It's a longitudinal relation. So in order to establish my thesis that we all inhabit one world, the key question we have to ask is, what exactly is the relation between the particular life and life as a whole? And I want to argue that this is a relation not of addition, not of summing things up, of life plus life plus life plus life plus life plus life equals life as a whole, but it's a relation of what I call correspondence. And again, the rope analogy helps. Correspondence means a relation of going along together and responding to one another as you go. And there's a difference I want to make, a distinction I want to make here between correspondence and interaction. Usually, when social scientists talk about social life, they tend to talk about people interacting with one another, as though each participant is an agent, and those agents are going back and forth, like in table tennis or ping pong, that it's a back and forth. First, I act towards you, you act towards me, I act towards you, you act towards me, and the ball goes back and forth like that. But with correspondence, it's not a back and forth movement, but a going along together movement. I mean, it's the difference between two companions walking down a street together side by side and conversing as they go, facing the same way, and then those two companions suddenly turning around, facing each other and having an argument. That's the shift from correspondence, going along together, to interaction, which is back and forth. And I want to argue for a sense here of correspondence as not lateral, back and forth, but longitudinal. Or another way to put it, again, through the analogy of the rope, is to say that it's a relation not of adherence, but coherence. And there are a whole lot of word pairings in the English language that where one pair starts with a or ad or at, and the other pair starts with co or con. These are prefixes of Latin origin. Com or co means with, and ad or at means at. So when you think adjoin, conjoin, aggregate, congregate, and many others, you can think of attract, contract. So you can play a game thinking of the number of different contrasts you can find, and every time it's the same distinction. At means a sort of spatial juxtaposition, like in a mosaic, where things are butt up against one another. Con means a longitudinal going along together through time. So if you compare, for example, the aggregation and the congregation, an aggregate is just a lot of things jumbled up together, but you imagine the participants in a congregation, they're people who bring their lives with them, and as they join in the congregation, those lives participate in one another. They correspond. They're going along together. So in the congregation, lives are laid alongside one another longitudinally. They're woven together like in the rope, rather than juxtaposed as in a mosaic. And so it's a difference, if you will, between exterior articulation, joining things up from the outside, and what I call interstitial differentiation. That is, things emerging as the things they are from within, from the midst of their involvement with one another. Perfectly clear in the case of social life. Or think of a young child, starts off as a baby, and gradually, as the child develops, becomes a personality in their own right. And that personality has emerged from within the flow of family life. So that you could say that each child in a family emerges as the person they are, with the life history they have, through a process of interstitial differentiation. They've emerged as the people they are from within that current of domestic life. And this means putting difference before alterity and not after it. This is very important, particularly following the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. Social scientists and people in the humanities write a lot about radical alterity, the idea that when we meet another person, we shouldn't judge them at all, we shouldn't put them in a categorical frame. There they are. There's this person completely different. We don't know anything about them. They're completely other. And it's then from that initial state of otherness that we can then start to try and build a conversation, get to know them, and so on. So that for Levinas, when you meet another person, that initial situation is one of total otherness. I think that's to put it the wrong way around. I think we should rather imagine otherness as something that is continually emergent within the field of social relations through a process of differentiation. And here again, I gave the example of children growing up in the family. If you think about relations between parents and children, Levinas has a very odd chapter in his book about the relationship with father and son. He doesn't quite understand women, so he's just talking about men here. And he imagines somehow this problem that the father encounters the son as this totally other being who he then has to somehow come to establish a relationship with. In my experience as a father of three sons, actually, is that it's quite the opposite. It's not that you encounter this strange person, you don't know who they are. It's rather that that in the course of childhood, that you have this wondrous feeling of that person actually emerging as a person in their own right, with their own characteristics, as distinct from you. So it's a gradual growing apart, like a branch from its stem. And I can't resist here mentioning the point that our word matter comes, of course, from material, was originally a word applied specifically to wood, subsequently generalized to all kinds of material. It was applied to wood by Roman carpenters. Why did Roman carpenters use for wood a term that otherwise meant mater? Because they were thinking about the way in which the branch of a tree emerges from the inside of the trunk. They were talking precisely about this process of interstitial differentiation, the way in which the child emerges from its mother's womb and becomes gradually a separate being in its own right, in the same way the branch grows on the tree. It's a very beautiful metaphor, and here we are using the word material without even thinking about it. But that's where it comes from. So it means that that otherness is something that arises from within the matrix of relations in which we are immersed ab initio from the start. Or in another word, it is a function of ontogenesis. Ontogenesis meaning the becoming of being. So differentiation is prior, alterity is derivative. So that people are different, not because they partake of multiple worlds. They're all fellow travelers in the same world, but it is a world that is always worlding. So now let me return to the question of the relation between the particular life and life as a whole. I mean, another word for life as a whole, commonly used, might be universal. So then it's a question of the relation between the particular and the universal. Now, following the thinking of Gilles Deleuze in his book, Difference and Repetition, the argument I want to make is that the relation between the particular and the universal, or between the particular life and life as a whole, the relation is not bilateral, but unilateral. And just to explain that, I'll use the example that Deleuze has. I mean, he's talking about the relationship between the line and the ground. If you consider a footpath in the ground that has been made by people walking over and over again along the same path, and you can say, yeah, I can see the line of this footpath. It's very clear. So I can separate the path from the ground, but can you separate the ground from the path? No, you can't, because the path is actually imprinted into the ground. It is part of the very substance of the ground itself. So Deleuze's point is there that you can distinguish the line from the ground without being able to distinguish the ground from the line. It's different, for example, if you took a surveyor's rope stretched between two pegs in the ground, and the rope then sort of overhangs the ground, then the difference would be bilateral, because it's perfectly possible to distinguish the surface of the ground from the surveyor's rope and the rope from the ground. But with the path, the difference is unilateral. Or you could take a sheet of paper, and here's a sheet of paper, and crumple it up, and then open it up again, and you get a beautiful landscape of creases. It's a very heterogeneous landscape, and you could follow these creases or valleys, and so you can say, yes, I can distinguish this crease here from the overall matrix of the paper, but you can't distinguish the paper from the crease. So it's not as though the sheet had somehow parted company with the crease and sunk back into flat homogeneity, leaving the crease line high and dry. So just as with the crease and the sheet, the particularity of the singular life distinguishes itself from the universality of life itself without the universals distinguishing itself from the particular. It's a unilateral relation. Now, I trying to think about this also in terms of another distinction between the self and the soul, and taking the soul here in a rather particular sense, which might not correspond to the Christian sense, but actually something rather closer to the sense of the soul that we get in anthropology through studies of people with cosmologies often called animistic. It's that kind of soul that I'm thinking of. In so-called Western thought, when we talk about the self, we think of it as this interior property of a human being, the I, that's somehow inside us, surrounded by an exterior body that allows the self to act and produce effects in the world. So the self has a body and It is embodied in that sense that it's inside there, and through the body, the self acts. And we think then that these selves, which belong to individual human beings, can be added up to form the kinds of collectivities we call societies. The soul is the other way round. What happens with the soul is not that you start with individuals and aggregate them into societies, but you start with a plenum of relationships, life as a whole, with that whole flux of being. And the task of life then is to differentiate particular beings from within that flux. So it's not that you start with the particular and then add them up to the general, but you start with the flux, and the task then is to try and differentiate from this flux particular places within it. And one way to think about this is like that each place is like a vortex. If you think of the whole flux as a river, but every so often the flow is being pulled aside a little bit, so it's going along, then it turns in on itself and then it runs along again, then that vortex is the soul. It's the flux of life wound up into a particular, temporarily into a particular being, for as long as that being lives. And the sort of nice implication of that is that actually when you die, you rejoin life, and that the life is actually holding out again. The particular life is a holding out against the flux of life in general, but after a while you can't hold out any longer, so you die, and then you sink back into the flux of life itself. So that's the idea of the soul as a constant reminder of the flux of the world that is wound up in the vortex, and of the continual effort required to hold out against it. So that means that the interiority of the soul, or a soul life, is not set over against the exteriority of bodies, as in the case of the self, but is immanent in the flow of life itself. So that means that the universal is not some kind of lowest common denominator, but a field of continuous variation. It's not a plane of indifference upon which diversity is overlain, but a plane of immanence from which difference is continually emerging. So the relationship between particular life and life as a whole is like the relation between the life of the soul and what we could call soul life. Well, then the next step in my argument is to relate this principle that I've been calling interstitial differentiation from the inside, to the problem of agency. I want to suggest that there is a connection between the question of how to reconcile the singular and the plural of the life of the soul with soul life, and the question of how to relate agency and patiency, or action and suffering. In fact, the connection is so intrinsic that it seems to me that these are really just alternative ways of posing the same problem. So the life of the soul is made up of doings, but soul life is what a living being undergoes. So our question is really about the relation between doing and undergoing, what we do and what we undergo. Now, in the grammar of most modern Indo-European languages, there is a distinction between the active and the passive voices of the verb. The active voice is for what one does, the passive is for what one undergoes. So I did this, this was done to me. So should we think of life in the active voice, or is it in the passive? Is it something you do or something you undergo? Or should we think of it in terms of some kind of interplay between the two? Or more precisely, should the active be framed within the passive or the passive within the active? Are the things we do the callings of a life that just happens to us, or are the things that happen to us called up by the things we do? Well, for those of us raised in an Indo-European linguistic environment, our usual habits of thought, which are conditioned, so of course not determined by the grammatical categories of the languages we speak, tend to put the agency of the individual out in front as the sovereign initiator of his or her actions, that is, as a self. So I did this, here am I, and this is what I did. So this self stands in opposition to the exterior environments of nature and society in which its actions have effects. And so we tend to set the agency of the particular life against a passive backdrop of life in general. But the principle of interstitial differentiation suggests, to the contrary, that the doings of every particular life continually emerge and distinguish themselves from within the plane of immanence that is life itself. And that's to frame doing within undergoing, and not the other way round. And it's to think of every doing not as a self-initiated action, but as a moment in the life of the soul. Such doings belong to us, such doings do not belong to us directly or exclusively. Rather, they belong to the memory of the whole, which is coiled up within us. Or another way of putting this is to think of everything we do as a task, because the task is something that falls to us as responsive and responsible beings as part of the life we undergo. It's a way, to go back to an earlier distinction, it's a way of corresponding with the world in which we live rather than of interacting with it. So if every doing is a task, we need to find a way of talking about agency that puts it inside undergoing. And with our conventional dichotomy between active and passive voices of the verb, this is a very difficult thing to do. But many non-European languages, as well as Indo-European in earlier times, such as in classical Greek, I don't know about Sanskrit, but possibly there too, many of these languages recognized what linguists call the middle voice of the verb. In the middle voice, agency is inside the action, inside the verb. Or as the linguist Emile Benveniste put it in a classic paper, in the middle voice, the doer achieves something that is achieved in him. It's a transformation. Maybe to fall in love, or something like that. It's something that you're doing, that it's happening to, you're inside it as it's happening. So there are examples, even in modern English. So my suggestion is that in the one world of becoming, life is lived neither in the active nor in the passive, but in the middle voice. And such is the life of the soul. Its particular life is not played out against the background of life itself, but emerges actively from its midst. So with life lived in the middle voice, our focus can no longer be on the essence of being. It must rather be on its ongoing generation. That's to say, it should be not so much a focus on ontology as a focus on ontogeny. Now, this idea of ontogenesis, or the becoming of being, was key to the philosophy of Gilbert Simondon, for whom it equated more or less to the process he otherwise called individuation. That is, in his words, the continual falling out of being from becoming. It corresponds, Simondon wrote, to a capacity beings possess of falling out of step with themselves, of resolving themselves by the very act of falling out of step. And I think he got this idea from the philosophy of Henri Bergson, the great hero of mine. Bergson talked about the way in which life itself always wants to move forward, like that flowing river, it's always going on, but that particular lives always wants to pull that movement aside. They'd like to deviate a little. So instead of going straight on, it curls to one side. And as it curls, it winds up on itself and forms this vortex. So that every living being, he said, is like an eddy in the flow of life. And it holds on for so long until then eventually the water rejoins the stream again. So in Bergson's idea, the living being is a sort of deflection or circulation in a flow of life that otherwise forges ahead. And as a fold or vortex in the flux of life, the soul retains a memory of the creative powers of the whole from which it was born, and which in turn hold the potential for further transformation. So in Simondon's terms, life itself, or what I've been calling soul life, is a never-ending process of individuation. But critically, the differentiations it engenders are concentrated not at some putative boundary with an outside world, but in its interior resonances. Or in a word, life as individuation, as lived in the middle voice, is a process of interstitial differentiation. Now, myself, I really dislike the idea of turns. For the most part, this idea, there's this turn and that turn particularly in the humanities. For the most part, I think the turn offers a pretext for tournaments of academic vanity. But if we must have such things to indicate the transitions in our thinking, then let's follow Simondon in calling for a turn that is not ontological. We've heard an awful lot about the ontological turn. Let's have a turn that is not ontological, but ontogenetic. So let our concern not be with philosophies of being, but with generations of being. You see, with multiple ontologies, everything or every being is its own world, closed in and complete, so that ultimately there are as many worlds as there are beings or things. Each has collapsed into itself, ultimately impenetrable to others. But with multiple ontogenies, or life cycles, every being or thing is open, subject to growth and movement, issuing forth along its own particular path within a world of nevertheless inexhaustible differentiation. So nothing in this world is settled once and for all, but ontogenesis allows us to reconcile singularity and multiplicity, agency and patiency within one world. As another philosopher, Alain Badiou, has argued, there is only one world, but it is a world that refuses any normative preconditions for existing in it, such as might be entailed, for example, in any naturalistic definition of universal humanity. I mean, how many times have we attempted to define human nature in terms of the common possession of this or that attribute, bipedalism, tool making, pair bonding, language, symbolic thought, only to discover that there are creatures born of man and woman who lack these attributes for whatever reason, and consequently find themselves excluded or at least considered less than human. But the one world we inhabit is not reserved for what the anthropologist Donald Brown called universal people. These universal people were creatures of the normative imagination, delineated by a suite of innate capacities and behavioral traits that all are supposed to share. It is rather this world of ever-emergent difference, which admits no boundaries of inclusion or exclusion. And in this world of becoming, though we may all be different, these differences, as I've argued, arise in the course of life through our entanglement in a world of relations. They don't separate us out, each to their own kind. So, as I alluded to at the beginning, if anything divides us, it's not difference, but identity. Because to seek what we have in common from the start is to presuppose our original disconnection. If difference draws us together, similarity as identity drives us apart. The political theorist William Connolly makes much the same point, emphasizing that to pit the universal against difference has the effect of reducing, and I'm quoting, the essentially relational character of difference to the bland idea of diversity among independent entities. So that's to reduce the differentiation of becoming to the diversity of being. So to undo that reduction, we have to put difference and the universal back together again. We should, and that is precisely what Badiou does. The single world, he argues, is precisely the place where an unlimited set of differences exists. So philosophically, far from casting doubt on the unity of the world, these differences are the principle of its existence. So I believe we should be fighting intellectually and politically for the recognition of this kind of world, a one world of infinite difference. So the question is then, what should we call it? And for an answer, we could turn to the thinking of William James, a founding figure in both psychology and the philosophy of pragmatism. And some lectures delivered in 1908. James proposed a solution to the problem of the one and the many by insisting that what he called the multiverse is simultaneously both singular and plural, for the simple reason that its oneness is never absolutely complete. It is, said James, strung along and not rounded and closed, so that regardless of the part or element on which you might choose to focus at whatever scale of level of exclusiveness or inclusiveness, there is always an overflow of relations. Wherever you are, there are further connections to be drawn, maybe direct, maybe through intermediaries. And in the drawing of these connections, even in their interpenetration, things lose nothing of their particularity. So perhaps we should call the universe, following James, the multiverse or the pluriverse. But there's still problems in figuring out how to relate the singular and the plural together. I mean, is our world a patchwork of multiple realities, irregularly stitched across their rough, unmatched, and sometimes overlapping edges? Or is it more like a braid, a thing of entwined and ever-extending pathways, binding longitudinally rather than transversely along their lines of growth and movement? Writing from his perspective as a student of science and technology, John Law presents an answer of the first kind. He wants to offer an alternative to the idea that everything there is can be made to fit into a single container universe, or what he calls the one world. In such a world, anything that cannot be made to fit, anything that flies in the face of universal reality, is simply written off as an instance of belief, and a mistaken belief at that. And in a world divided between colonized and colonizers, what the colonized take for truth, the colonizers tend to dismiss as figments of culture or worldview. But this is a logic that, of course, fails in a post-colonial era in which different and incommensurable realities grind against one another with no assurance of reconciliation or containment. So for John Law, we now live in an era of what he calls the fractiverse, a set of contingent, enacted and more or less intersecting worlds in the plural. But then we're back to these multiple worlds in the plural. So we're back to where we started, with the many as opposed to the one. And perhaps that's because of Law's focus on the being of things rather than their becoming, on ontologies rather than ontogenies. Because realities, multiple as they are, seem on law's account to have already fallen out from the milieu of their generation. So I think that in order to recover the oneness of the world, we need to move upstream and to correspond with things in the moment of their appearing, rather than assembling what has already appeared through exterior articulation. And that is, in effect, to seek an answer of the second kind. That is, to compare life to a braid, or as I've suggested earlier, to a rope. Returning to the philosophy of James, but in the context of contemporary geopolitics, the anthropologist Arturo Escobar hints at just such an answer. For Escobar, the one world is the globe of corporate capitalism, epitomized in the celebrated logo of the World Bank, a spherical graticule shorn of life, elements, and people. This is indeed a world that is rounded in and closed, as James would have put it, in which everything there is has been reduced to liquid commensurability. It's a world of commodities and monetary values, from which people are overwhelmingly marginalized, if not actually locked out. But against this global one world, and with acknowledgement to James, Escobar reintroduces what he calls the pluriverse. It might be described, he writes, as a process of planetarization articulated around a vision of the earth as a living whole that is always emerging out of the manifold biophysical, human, and spiritual elements and relations that make it up. So, unlike Law's fractiverse, Escobar's pluriverse is unambiguously correspondent. Its plurality arises not from chains of exterior connection, but from the cascades of individuation or interstitial differentiation by which the earth as a living whole, in Escobar's words, is continually emerging. And I think it's to the one worldness of this whole that we should remain committed. As I stated at the outset, the world is a conversation. It's not the object of our conversation. And in the conversation, lives twist around one another as they go along, both answering and being answered to. And that precisely is what it means to correspond. So finally, one world thinking begins here in the recognition that people are different not because they belong to other worlds, but because they are fellow travelers in the same world, a world nonetheless of inexhaustible and interminable variation. It begins with the conversation. And in this conversation lies ontogenesis, the becoming of being. And I think it's high time to restore ontogenesis, the skeleton in the cupboard of ontology, to the animating currents of our one world. We'll then find that every particular life is both an open-ended exploration of the possibilities of being this world affords and a contribution to its ongoing formation, to its worlding. It is in this sense a never-ending quest for an answer to the question of what being human or to be alive in the world actually means. But every answer is a response and not a solution. Responding to the question, we respond to one another, that is, we correspond. So life is a question to which there is no answer. But in this one world of ours, we are all tasked with looking for it, and it's in the search that all life is lived. And it's just as well that there is no final solution, for that indeed will put an end to us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ingold. That was, one of the richest presentations I've heard in such a long time, Professor Ingold. I I really don't know even how to respond to it. There's so many nuggets there to take away. I mean, and you know, you've already announced the ontogenetic turn, and you've talked about so many things, the middle voice. You know, when you were talking about Levinas, I was reminded of the fact that he talks about, you know, when one comes face to face with the other, and he invokes the category of sensibility, you know, and I was thinking that I was finding a resonance of that in your work too. But I think what you've articulated in terms of you know, not what is often talked about in the context of Levinas, that ethics as first philosophy, as before ontology or epistemology, but even ontogenesis as prior to even ontology or even ethics. I think it will make us rethink ethics and politics in a completely you know, different kind of a way. So I mean, there's so much there in your talk, Professor Ingold, and you know, we are honored actually to have people like Professor Silvia Gerardi and Laura and others join us from different parts, and Tanya and others who have come from different parts, and you know, from New Mexico and other parts. But you know, I saw her also take vigorous notes, and I've taken so many notes, you know, about the things that you articulated, not living together but giving together. You know, interstitial differences, where you invoked even Deleuze. And I was thinking about, you know, when you talked about unilateralism, I mean, that's also something that that one needs to really rethink with, you know, and this, you know, I mean, it's such a rich presentation, Professor Ingold. I think one has to hear it again and, you know, keep hearing it again. You are, Professor Ingold, one of the most original thinkers of our times. And, you know, I mean, your presentation is actually just a validation of the point that we already know about you and your work. And, you know, I've really, I mean, thank you so much for that. And I really don't want to hog all the time here, but I'm sure there are hundreds of questions which are there waiting for you. But Professor Ingold, we are deeply indebted. And I think our conference has got so enriched because of your contribution to it. Thank you so much, Professor Ingold. Really grateful.
Well, thank you. That's fine. But anyway, I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody's got any.
Yes.
Thank you again, Professor Ingold. This is Anso Senelius right here. We had posted a request for questions in the chat box. We've received several questions. At the moment, I will take the task of posting those questions to you. If you allow, because we have a limited time that we are working with, I may club questions together which are similar. Is that okay, Professor Ingold?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Perfect. Thank you very much. So over to the first two questions, which I've clubbed together. The questions read, thank you for that very engaging talk, Professor Tim Ingold. You spoke of the centrality of ontogenics and the significance of generations of being. I was wondering where you place the life of objects or life of things within this framework, a concern that is taken up time and again by new materialistic studies. And the second question, which I'm reading along with this, is how can we think of this idea of difference and conversational community with respect to the non-human other? What may be the implications of a life of correspondence in addressing contemporary ecological concerns?
Okay, two little questions. Anyway, first on new materialism. I mean, this is the in thing at the moment, and you know that new materialism is just a label that covers an enormous diversity of approaches, many of which, well, they're only in partial agreement with one another. So there's lots of disagreements within new materialism itself, and it would take too long to summarize all these approaches and where they converge and diverge. But the one thing that links them all, I think, is simply that we should take materials seriously instead of because previously there's been a lot of writing about objects, but not about the materials themselves. And once we bring in the materials, we recognize that actually materials themselves have a certain vitality. They have ways of doing things which are not necessarily our own, and we have to engage with them. And that's what it's all about. And I've been part of that myself. And the thing that the view that I've really wanted to push, which relates to what I said today, is that we have to unpack the Deleuzian concept of agencement and not simply regard it as assemblage. And the trouble with assemblage, which is an impossible word, we get into impossibilities of translation here between French and English. It really is a muddle. But in my talk, I was distinguishing between aggregation and congregation, about the way in which you can join things up through exterior contact, and the way things can emerge from within the midst of their going along together. And I think when we start looking at materials and the material world, we always find these two principles conjoined. But the trouble I've found with a lot of the literature in new materialism is that they've got the two, either they ignore one side and take only the other, or they get the two mixed up. And I think it's really important to understand how they relate to one another. And just to give you one quick example, of this, which is, imagine you have a kit to build a model, like a model aeroplane, and you get a kit that has all the different plastic parts and some instructions which show how they all fit together, rather like a jigsaw, to create the airplane as a whole. So they say all you need is this kit. It's got all the parts, but actually you'll need one other thing: a tube of glue. So you need glue, and you think, well, what's that doing? I mean, is that another part? Or what? And then you realize that actually what the glue does is glue is made of these long protein molecules that when they meet a smooth plastic surface, the molecule doesn't see that as a smooth surface, it sees it as a lattice, and it penetrates into the lattice on this side and on the other side, and then it dries, and it literally knits the two sides together. I mean, that's how glue works. So that you've got these set of bits of plastic that join by external contact, but it only holds together because through all of that is a weave of these long fibers that tie it all up, and that's the glue. So what I've been trying to show in relation to much of the new materialist stuff is how these two principles can join, and without the binding thing, nothing would actually hold together or last. Things would adhere, but they wouldn't cohere. So that's on that question. On the non-human other, I mean, first of all, I think the argument I presented was not really meant to be limited to humans. Quite to the contrary. I might have used the word human now and again, but the whole point is that that a difference, a we-ness, a sense of we that spreads from where I am out without limit, doesn't suddenly stop at the boundaries of the human species, however those might be defined. It can carry on and on and on as far as you like, so that the non-human other. I mean, there's a wonderful guy, Dominique Lestel, working in France, who's talked about that every community is actually a hybrid. There's a hybrid multi-species community. There can be no such thing as, say, human society or baboon society, as though you could somehow equate a society with all the individuals of a particular species. Any kind of community involves all sorts of beings and things. But what goes with that too is that this word non-human is really horrible, because it is itself a precipitate of our idea of the human. And actually, people who use non-human all the time are completely human-centric in their approach. The worst offender being Bruno Latour, but because he says that humans are completely exceptional in the animal kingdom in the way in which they recruit non-humans into their lives. Other animals don't do that. So the whole thing is built on a premise of human exceptionalism. If we're really going to be radical about this, then we have to say that if I was a reindeer, I've done fieldwork in Lapland, I often think about reindeer. If I were a reindeer, then there would be reindeer and non-reindeer. And if I was a seagull, we have lots of them here in Aberdeen, there would be seagulls and non-seagulls. So it just depends on who you are. So the world is only divided between humans and non-humans if you happen to be very obsessed about your own humanity. But if you were again, if you're a cat, you'll probably be more obsessed about your catness and think, anyway, so that's the thing about the non-human other.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ingold. We have many questions, so I'm taking up the next two together as well. This question is from Levin Ahmed, who writes, Ibrahim Kendi famously argued that the greatest white privilege is life itself. Could you please tell us how to coexist with each other in the ratio capital O scene when socio-ecological fabric is torn apart by various oppressive structures, causing irreparable cut and mistrust within intra-species and interspecies relationalities? How can we envision a pluri-universe without invoking the political questions about reparations? Another question I'm taking from Anab Nair is, Professor Ingold, do you think of any, could you elaborate on the challenges which you were thinking about, as you said, in quotation, putting the difference and the universal back again, the challenges in putting the difference and universal back again? Over to you, Professor.
These are really political questions. It's a question where the philosophical endeavor actually bumps up against the hard edges of politics, and you start asking questions about, well, what should we do about things? And given the fact that we live in a world of massive inequalities that is the legacy of several centuries of colonial oppression, fact, we have to deal with that, then the fact that our current world is being torn apart in all sorts of ways, from extractive industry to climate change and the rest of it. The question is, what do we do? And the challenge to me is well, that I've presented a philosophy that, for instance, nowhere in my talk did I make any reference to the history of colonialism. So I presented a philosophy that somehow looks very pure, as though we could just forget about. We could have this wonderful vision for a new world in which we can all carry along in our differences, simply turning a blind eye to the historical conjuncture that we've inherited and we find ourselves in. So how on earth do we reconcile these two? I mean, I don't have an answer to that. If I did, goodness knows, nobody has an answer to it. But what I do, and maybe I can't deny that maybe I'm a privileged white male from Britain, the rest of it, and maybe this answer would reflect that perspective that I inevitably have. But I think it's a shame if all these intellectual issues, or even if there is a beauty of life, that the sheer joy of it is sucked down into a political vortex. What would be the point of politics, of struggle, if we forget what it is that we're struggling for? And that has to be sometimes asserted. So in dreaming of a world that is, what we have to dream about is a world that is fit for coming generations to inhabit, and we have to do what we can to set up the conditions for such a world to exist. So far as I can see, we have to think about how can we create a world that is fit for coming generations to inhabit, and that means that we can't always be retrospective in our evaluations. We've got to be hoping about a possible future, and that means that there are things that we have to put behind us, and I think even a lot of there's been a wonderful series on our UK television just recently on empire and on the legacy of empire. The presenter is South Asian heritage, and tells about all the prejudice that he's experienced as a citizen of Britain, having grown up in the country, and it's terrible. But and all of and the fact that our children here are never taught about the violence of empire, about the things that were done in your country, for example. Children are just not taught about it, and are kept in ignorance about it, and that is wrong. But the point of that education is so that we can move on, and I think actually the key word is education. I mean, it's more to me an educational question than a political one, or to say that actually politics is education, because education is the way in which a society creates its own future. It's the way in which we can secure the continuity of life. And so the whole question is, how can we educate in such a way that allows young people to understand where they're coming from, but at the same time have the possibility to build a new world for themselves, so that each generation can actually build, not simply be the inheritors of a world that has been made for them, but actually can create a world anew. And we have to be able to create the conditions for that. And I think that's rather than reparation is obviously an issue, but I think that must be the guiding question, how we do that.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Ariane Conti. She writes, "Thank you so much for your brilliant talk. I am interested in understanding your response to many anthropologists like Vivero de Castro, who have been calling for multiple worlds, the fracti or multiverse that you had mentioned in your talk. Unlike these thinkers, you're calling for one world of infinite variation. I'm wondering how this might relate to relativism and to truth, attempting to determine whether some of these variations might be more true than others, like whether sorcery can control the rain, to return to an old anthropological debate."
Okay, well, with Eduardo Viveros de Castro, we're old friends, so I don't really have the thing about Eduardo's ideas is that they're how to put it, they're very neat. I mean, you can see that he spent a lot of time in Paris. That because the way he thinks is that, well, here we have the Western system. Here we have naturalism, as we understand it, the basic sort of culture and nature and all of that. And now I've done field work in Amazonia. Of course, they don't think like that. So what we'll do is put the whole Western thing neatly inverted, so that instead of one nature and many cultures, we have instead of multi-cultures, we have multi-natures, and so on and so forth. So the whole thing is a very neat symmetrical cosmology. But that's clever, very clever, and it makes an awful lot of sense of a lot of the kind of ethnographic material that we have to deal with. Eduardo in Amazonia, but I'm as a student of people in indigenous societies in the circumpolar north, find many of the same things work there too. So in the sense it works. But then the question I ask myself is, how is it that if you were born as a little child in Amazonia or in the Arctic, you grow up becoming a perspectivist or an animist rather than a Western naturalist? What happens? Because these are presented as complete, fully formed cosmologies. It's just that one is the inverse of the other. So how do you start thinking how is a child growing up in a society? Do you think in this way rather than that? And the only answer that that theorists like Eduardo can come up with is, well, obviously they're socialized into it. And you think, wait a moment, how does socialization work? It works by supposing you have this raw material of humanity and then you imprint a human model on it, which is, of course, a naturalistic idea. So, so if instead we were to start from thinking about, well, what happens when a child grows up? How do children think about things? One of the things you find, we certainly find in northern circumpolar societies, is actually everybody's working things out for themselves. And they're talking about it, but there is no ready-made cosmology at all. In fact, these things are subject to continuous discussion. I mean, ethnographers have even noted how remarkable it is that in these societies, nobody actually agrees on the meanings of many words. The words, people say, oh, no, the word, you just have to, you'll find the meaning, you'll find out what it means. Just pay attention, listen to what people are saying. Let's take a look at the world, and then maybe you'll understand what I mean by this or that. So that all the meanings of things are always sort of at stake. they're always open, and that's what I meant by if we move from ontology to ontogeny, we can move from multiple worlds to one world, because as soon as you start thinking about how is it that we come to know in a particular way, or anybody comes to know in a particular way, then it's all opened up. And rather than having multiple separate conversations, you have one, or maybe conversations that kind of bleed into one another, but are not isolated. Okay, that's the question. I think there was another part to the question, and now I've forgotten what it was, but maybe that will do for now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Tim Ingold. We have unfortunately run out of time. We have many more questions our participants wanted addressed to you. But thank you so much once again. I am handing over the virtual mic to Juby for the official vote of thanks. Thank you.
I'll take over from here, Susan. Thank you so much. Dear friends, it has been a wonderful lecture indeed. And on behalf of the Department of English and the organizing team, I would like to thank everyone who made this event successful. First and foremost, a huge thank you to our speaker, Professor Ingold, who has been so kind to us by giving us so much to think about. We will no doubt be talking about today's discussion for quite some time into the future. Thank you for lending us so much of your time, Professor Ingold, and for sharing your work with us. As always, thank you to our head of the department, Professor Simi Malhotra, who is the leading force behind this conference and today's special keynote lecture. Thank you, Juby and Susan, Anab, and everyone on the organizing team who are responsible for running our events so smoothly. And thank you to our audience, everyone who tuned in from all sorts of time zones and places. Thank you so much, friends. And we hope to see you all again very soon for the third session of the conference on planetarity, performance, motion, and emotion, scheduled for today from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ingold. So grateful.
Bye.
So grateful.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.